Hello, hello, everybody. Good to see you out there. I see the numbers coming in. Welcome to Scholars for Social Justice, this Leith Mullings Salon. We're going to give people a few minutes to come in. It's great to see you all virtually. Happy to be in community with you all. So please hold tight. We'll give folks a few minutes, but welcome. The number is slowly going up as people get let into the webinar. Thank you all for coming. Please know as you come in that this event is being recorded and it will go on our YouTube page, Scholars for Social Justice. Yes, we have a YouTube page with all of our events, speakers, programming. This will be added to that menu. So just please know if you speak, ask questions, what have you, this will be on YouTube shortly. Tell your friends if they can't be here, they can watch it there. As you can see, hopefully in the chat, there is our YouTube page that you can check out as you wait for people to come in or afterwards, or you can use that to refer people to that page if they would like to see this event or any of our other events from the recent past. So we're going to give it one more minute before we begin. But again, we're happy to have you here at our Leith Mullings Salon. Okay, so let's start. And as people come in, they can enjoy the conversation. So we are here in Zoom world. This event is brought to you by Scholars for Social Justice. And we are so extremely excited to be here in conversation with you. And in this conversation about Dylan Rodríguez's amazing book, White Reconstruction. So just first, a little bit about Scholars for Social Justice. SSJ was founded to create space for radical and progressive scholars to engage, agitate, and organize outside of the formal and often stifling context of the academy. Our main goal was to also be in collaboration with and in service to the racial and social justice movements. We are deeply committed to the ongoing struggle against white supremacy and white nationalism in their blatant and insidious forms, which is why the leadership and founders of SSJ were scholars of color, and particularly Black women scholars. This is done so that Black and brown agency and leadership did not become an afterthought. We realize that there are rich reservoirs of knowledge outside of the academy. So we welcome unaffiliated and independent scholars, researchers, and educators into our ranks. We also realize the university is not just faculty. We are eager to work with students, campus workers, and those in the communities adjacent to our campuses. Our first project a number of years ago was a national working group on reparations in higher education. Our current focus is on campus abolition and reparations projects led by members and friends of SSJ around the country. For this project, we are operating under the rubric of ARIS, abolition, reparations, investment in dispossessed communities, and safety. So that is our larger framework for this year and for the next couple of years. And as a part of that framing, we are presenting to you our second Leith Mullings Social Justice Salon. This is the second in the series that Scholars for Social Justice has launched, the Leith Mullings Social Justice Salon. Leith was an amazing anthropologist and radical scholar activist. And the Salon aims to feature work that follows Leith's honest, imaginative, and bold example, and to promote a conception of scholarship that amplifies the many mediums of study through which knowledge is produced. So that can mean books, art, documentary films, op-eds, podcasts, whatever work is out there that's furthering a progressive radical agenda. We want to feature that as a part of this Leith Mullings Salon. In that spirit, tonight we have Dylan Rodríguez speaking about white Reconstruction, and our next upcoming salon will feature the work of Erica Edwards and her master project, The Other Side of Terror, Black Women and the Culture of U.S. Empire. That salon will be October 13th at the same time as this one. That's a Thursday, and we will meet again at 6:30 Eastern, 5:30 Central, 3:30 Pacific. But tonight, we have a conversation between the one and only Rachel Herzing and Dylan Rodríguez, talking about white Reconstruction. Rachel Herzing has been an organizer, activist, and advocate fighting the violence of surveillance, policing, and imprisonment since the 1990s. Rachel's professional work has included roles as executive director of the Center for Political Education, a resource for political organizations on the left and progressive social movements. She was co-director of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to abolishing the prison industrial complex. And Rachel was also director of research and training at Creative Interventions, a community resource that develops interventions to interpersonal harm that do not rely on policing, imprisonment, or traditional social services. So all this talk about abolition is current vogue. She has been in the cut, in the mix for decades. And she is currently a community advisor to the Center for Political Education. She will be in conversation with somebody we all know, Dylan Rodríguez, who is a teacher, scholar, and collaborator who is committed to building and supporting abolitionist, liberationist, anti-colonial, and other forms of radical community and movement. Since 2001, he was appointed co-director of the Center for Ideas and Society. He has been a professor at the University of California, Riverside, and he has participated as a founding member of organizations like Critical Resistance, the Abolition Collective, Critical Ethnic Studies Association, Cops Off Campus, Scholars for Social Justice, and Blackness Unbound, amongst many others. Dylan is the author of 3 books, most recently the book under discussion tonight, White Reconstruction, Domestic Warfare, and the Logic of Racial Genocide, that came out with Fordham University Press. This book won the 2022 Frantz Fanon Book Award from the Caribbean Philosophical Association. Tonight, Rachel will be in conversation with Dylan about his amazing new book, White Reconstruction. We are happy to have them here discussing abolition, domestic warfare, and the terror of reform. Rachel, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Devarian. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mia, also for getting us set up tonight, and everybody at Scholars for Social Justice for the invitation to be here. I was just confessing earlier that I'm nervous to talk to academics because I am no scholar. I am a person who's had lots and lots of formal academic training with no degree to show for it. But I would say that all of my formal training is in anthropology. So I feel extra honored to be here as part of this series that's dedicated to Leith Mullings. She really was such an exemplary anthropologist, and I'm entering into this conversation with her commitment to social movements on my mind. So really so grateful to be here, even though I kind of slid in through the side door. So Dylan, what's up? You ready to talk about your book?
I don't know. I don't have a choice now. I'm in this now.
It's here. Everybody's looking at you, so I think it's on. I just want to mention that We're going to be dealing with questions in, I don't know, about an hour or so. So if there are things that you want to get into, I think there's a Q&A function. Yeah, there is a Q&A function, the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, or you can put stuff in chat. The question that's in the Q&A right now around captioning was not enabled for this particular webinar, I have learned. So apologies for that. And my guess is that if you watch it later on the YouTube channel, you can turn on captioning. No questions in the chat, says Devarian. So Devarian's in charge, so I yield to him. Questions in the Q&A only, please. Also, I will tell you, if you raise your hand, I will not call on you. So questions in the Q&A only, please. All right, Dylan, let's talk about your book. So
Hey, we don't just have to talk about the book, by the way. The book is a provocation toward other things, so we don't need to fixate on the book. I appreciate that, though.
All right. I mean, you know me. I'm prone to tangent, and I'm should warn everybody. I will not be doing a kind of traditional book talk interviewer style, which is like, how did the book come to be? I'm not going to start there. I'm going to start somewhere else. I'm going to start at the end a little bit, which is or the beginning and the end simultaneously. I feel like we're in a period where people play a little fast and loose with their terminology. The word abolition comes to mind, for instance. And so what I would like to do at the jump here, and this is the community educator and me coming out, I want to just have you, Dylan, articulate in your own words what you mean by some of these kind of fundamental terms that undergird a lot of your arguments in the book. So I'm starting with the big winner, and I know people should buy the book, but we'll give them a little taster so that they want to buy the book more, right? So white Reconstruction, what the hell? Break it down for us. Why white Reconstruction? What are you trying to get at by using that concept?
Right on. Well, first, peace to Leith Mullings and peace to my mentor, James Turner, who passed away about a month and a half ago. And thank you to Devarian and Mia. Thank you to Rachel. I'm talking to y'all from occupied Cahuilla-Tonga, Lucenio land down the street from where the Riverside Police Department ended the life of Taisha Miller in 1998. I just like to call that forward every time I'm on the grounds of this university. White Reconstruction is an attempt to name a logic of civilization building in which the kind of pathways and violence of chattel, of conquest, of occupation, of apartheid, of genocide, and of war are constantly subject to reform, to revision, and to change in ways that are oftentimes inclusive, that are solicitous and multiculturalist, especially in recent periods, but not limited to recent periods. I mean, that's part of what I write about in the book. Folks talk about the growth of multiculturalist and DEI mandates to include people in some of these machineries of warfare and policing, including incarceration and occupation, as if they're somehow relatively new things. And they are, but they aren't. And that's part of what I try to think about in the book, is to think about what are some of the precedents for this long civilizational project, which is premised on asymmetrical war, when it is pushed toward reform, when it's pushed to revise itself, precisely because people's liberation struggles, their anti-colonial struggles, their struggles against occupation, to free themselves from incarceration and dominance. When they're successful, when they threaten to end the civilizational project, what happens? And the argument that I make in the book is that this logic of Reconstruction is actually central to civilization building, not just U.S. nation building, but to the civilizational project, that you see it constantly and all the time. And I want to think about that with special urgency, because I think we're in that moment now. We're in an extended, intensified moment of Reconstruction, of white Reconstruction now. And it's not merely, it's minimally about the resurgence of far right-wing white nationalism, right? That's just one conspicuous part of it. I'm perhaps more concerned about the progressive, liberal, reformist-oriented movements that have begun to essentially brand and articulate themselves as being something other than what they are, which is a sustenance of these logics of civilization. And part of what we learn quickly, if we're serious about being liberation fighters and we're students and intellectuals within liberation struggle, is that the civilization project has to fucking end. right? There's no way to tolerate the existence of the civilizational project and actually find one's way toward liberation and freedom. Like this is something that generations and generations of people fighting for freedom have figured out well before this moment. And yet there's a certain kind of narcissism and arrogance that I think we inhabit sometimes in our historical period, where we think that we can somehow, engage in magical thinking and reform this shit so it's livable and it can actually accommodate people's freedom and being, and it cannot. It cannot, and that's why I want to think about this particular moment of white Reconstruction as something embedded in a longer history of that. And it's violent. It's deeply and fundamentally violent in an asymmetrical, often one-directional way.
It's really helpful. Thank you for laying that out like that. And you just used another one of these terms that I want to make sure we're getting clarity on. Reformism, or reform, rather. Let's just say reform or reformist here. And I'm interested in how you're conceptualizing that in relationship to white Reconstruction, in relationship to abolition.
I want to really emphasize one thing about, and I'm going to call it reformism, right? Because I think reform is a tactical question that we can debate. We can and we should engage in tactical, sometimes strategic debates about specific types of reform. I think that is worth talking about. When I say reformism, I'm talking about a type of political program and commitment. And the thing I want to emphasize about reformism is that I think a lot of us tend to underestimate just how fucking militant it is, right? The term militant gets attached to radicals, to revolutionaries, anti-colonialists, and Black liberationists, because appropriately, right? Because as I just invoked the late James Turner. I mean, he taught me that militancy is about a state of mind and intensity of commitment. So it's appropriately attached to those forms of struggle and movement. But reformists are just as militant, right? They're just as militant in asserting their belief, number one, that the horizon of political possibility is reform. That's the militancy. And that anything beyond that is either irresponsible, it's adventurous, it's going to get you killed, it's going to subject your people to further harm, and so forth and so on. There are numerous rationales and narratives about why it is that we need to shut the horizon down at reform, which is really to tell us that we are obligated to live within the existing apparatus, to live within the existing system. That's the militancy of reformism, and that's the term I wanted to emphasize within the definition of reformism, is that it's a commitment, and it's a massive commitment. It's an armed and militarized commitment, right? I mean, this is what happens is I want to talk for just a second about how dangerous reformism is to people who are on the side of liberation, abolition, revolution, and anti-colonial struggle. Because what reformism does is it actively criminalizes and endangers people who are engaged in those other types of radical and revolutionary commitment, right? By preaching to people who might otherwise be swung to the side of the radical revolutionary, anti-colonial, abolitionist position, that to do so is irresponsible and dangerous, and that those folks are crazy, those folks are irresponsible, those folks are going to get you killed, and they actually, sometimes folks will say they belong on the other side of those bars, of those borders, of that apartheid wall, sometimes of that rifle. So as far as I'm concerned, reformism is at the heart of the civilizational project. It's at the heart of what we, for a long time, called the prison industrial complex. We need to keep calling it that. Right? We need to keep pushing back against this terminology of mass incarceration. We need to understand it for what it is. It's prison industrial complex, it's domestic warfare. And the way these things stay alive, the way they sustain themselves, the way they expand their technologies of violence are through these various types of reformist militancy.
All right. I want to come back to the kind of war making and the violence in a moment, but I do want to do this last term, which I think is the big winner term for your book, and I think the big winner term for a lot of what you think about and do, which is abolition. And you use it you mobilize it toward a variety of purposes in the book. And sometimes, as I mentioned, it's very specific, and sometimes it's very expansive, right? So you talk about like abolition as futurity, and you talk about abolition as creativity, and you talk about, abolition as praxis, right? And then you also talk about the abolition of specific aspects and the entirety of the prison industrial complex. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about kind of the nugget, right? Even though you're deploying it in all these different ways, what's at the heart of what you're trying to communicate when you're talking about abolition?
So I need to be 100% with everybody here that Rachel is one of the people who's emboldened me to talk about abolition in a certain kind of way now. And that's how I'm going to frame it, because I think we need to emphasize that abolition means destruction. Abolition means particular institutions, relations of power, epistemologies, ways of being in the world. People actually need to be destroyed. And I'm talking about they need to be destroyed if those peoples who are vulnerable to their warfare, their asymmetrical, one-sided, colonial, chattel, genocidal warfare, if they are to ever find some capacity for liberated being, then those things actually must be destroyed. There is no way out of it. They have to be destroyed. So if there was one thing I would revise if I was ever to do like a new epilogue for this book or something like that, it would be that. Because I think with abolition, let me say one thing that I really want to emphasize is it's irresponsible to talk about abolition without immediately framing it as part of a global historical diasporic continuity and multiple streams of Black revolutionary and liberation struggle. That's what abolition is. So I want to say, I just want to be on record for that, being somebody of Filipino descent who's, engaged with this work, who's been a student of Black liberation struggle and Black thought for so many years and engaged in abolitionist work for so many years. I think it's crucial to stay grounded in that stream, in that continuity, in that foundation, right? And again, I think it's dangerous when abolition gets abstracted from that long continuity of political work. I'll also say that the reason why I think it's so crucial to emphasize the necessity of destruction is that I think destruction creates the grounds of possibility for futurity, for vulnerable targeted people. Right? This is why people set police stations on fire. This is why people throw police cars over. This is why people are in the streets risking life and limb and risking further harm and vulnerability, because they realize that in order to create the capacity for any hope toward futurity, for any possibility of grasping and touching futurity, that there are particular relations, things, institutions, and people that actually must be destroyed. So when we think abolition, we think that it's something beyond revolutionary possibility. Because what you're actually talking about is the end of civilization. You're talking about something on the other end of civilization, but I think it is really important that when we say that, we understand that civilization is actually the kind of subject and object of destruction. We need to destroy civilization and the civilizational project. And I'm not saying that romantically. I'm not saying that in an abstract, abstractly theorized way. I'm talking about honoring, on the one hand, that long diasporic tradition of Black revolutionary struggle that took destruction fucking seriously. Right? There's this, I think this long-running, deeply anti-Black caricature of Black revolutionary and Black abolitionist struggle when it undertakes carefully thought out, theorized, strategized, and tactical attempts at destroying certain relations of anti-Black domination, apartheid, and so forth, as if these are somehow immature, not well thought out, irresponsible, and regrettable. And I think it's really important to push back against that. I think it's important to push back against that and kind of honor how difficult it is for people to undertake the work of destruction. So when I say that, I bear the weight of saying it. And I'll also say this is something that I don't think most academics are willing to entertain, much less do, which is why I kind of live in a cultivated tension with the identity of academic, because I think it's aspirational. I think it's deeply colonial and white supremacist, and so forth. So I love the identity of scholar. That's why I'm down with SSJ. I'll do scholar. I'll do intellectual. You know what I mean? I'll do collaborator. I'll do your friend. Academic, I'm not so sure about. I think I don't want that. I think actually maybe academic is one of the positions that actually needs to be undermined and possibly destroyed as well. So it's just to say that about abolition. I mean, there's a lot of folks out there writing about abolition as building, Ruthie and Miriam and, you and so many people that are writing about the creative necessities, the productive capacities of abolition right now, right here, as well as toward some kind of abolitionist futurity. I mean, y'all are doing it, and I'm learning from you all the time. I feel like my role in this particular conversation is to try to complement some of the thinking and doing and practicing and making that everyone else around me is doing in such a loving way by saying we need to actually think about destruction. Destruction is also creativity. Let me end this part of my comments by saying that destruction is also a form of creativity and making.
Yeah, I really appreciate you raising that. And, you know, I'm wondering a bit, Dylan, if you can, it's provocative to say that, I think, in this period, to talk about the fact that things need to be destroyed and that abolition is actually about tearing down, because so much energy is being put now, I think, in a somewhat recuperative project, and you should correct me if you think differently, but it feels like a recuperative project on the part of, you know, thinkers primarily, less, I think, on the part of organizers, but people who think about abolitionist politics seem to be on a like, well, it's really about building, and we really, you know, we want it to be like happy and building what we need. And, you know, that's true. And as you've said, I believe that, and I say that as well, but I think we're not going to build our way necessarily out of the prison industrial complex. So if you are a prison industrial complex abolitionist, particularly, I think, if you're an organizer, you have to identify enemies, you have to identify targets, and you need to get them out of your way so that the stuff you want can flourish. And I'm just wondering if you can comment a little bit more on that, because I think it is a bit of a provocative thing to say in this period. So if you can contextualize it in the period that we're in, I think that'd be helpful.
Let me start with something that I think everybody who watches and listens and reads this could do in terms of abolitionist practices of destruction. Name that shit in the room that nobody else wants to name. All right, like this is part of what we fail to do because we privilege civility and getting along way too much in certain rooms, which means we actually tolerate liberal reformist bullshit. We let that stuff get traction. I'm talking about in scholarly circles, study groups, organizing projects, whatever, you know, specific grassroots movements. Y'all are convening at a protest or a demonstration or, you know, some other kind of action, right? Whatever it might be. I'm saying as soon as that tendency creeps in, or as soon as it presents itself, meaning the liberal, progressive, reformist militancy that says we can't go too far, right? We can't destroy, we must not destroy anything. We cannot be violent. There's the word violent. People will invoke the word violent when you talk about destruction. Notice I didn't say that. I was saying destruction. I was talking about destruction. I didn't say violence, right? You know why I didn't say violence is because I think we need to keep coming back to a collective study and theorization of what we mean when we say violence, especially in these conversations, right? Like, are we going to name particular tactics, acts, and ways of thinking as violent? I actually think maybe we should, right? Like, in other words, if we're thinking about a form, let me talk in scholarly terms and, you know, intellectual terms. If we're talking about a form of epistemological destruction, if we're trying to destroy a way of thinking, that actually can and must be named as a violent act. I'm not running from that, you know, and that's going to make people feel like a part of them is being disrupted and taken down, because it is, right? And so this is what you encounter when you get into any serious conversation guided by abolitionist militancy, for example, around police power, right? Around gendered ableist police power. You attack that shit, right? And if there's folks in the room who aren't already with you, they feel it on their bones, in their nerves, you know, in their heart, like you are doing violence to them. And you know what? It's because in a way you actually are, right? You are attacking and potentially destroying a way of thinking. You are destroying a certain part of their identity. So I say this because I think we need to understand that. I think we need to honor that. And we also need to, in most ways, collectively embrace it instead of running from it, right? And that's what I mean is that we're such a community of smart people, you know, but there's these strange and erratic ways in which we fall back into simplistic bullshit when we start thinking about violence and destruction. I think it also has to do with a fear of anger, you know, which is in many ways totally appropriate, because anger is like steeped in, you know, heteronormative patriarchy and colonialism and all, you know, anger is like attached to all these forms of oppressive and you know, deracinating power. but it's also indispensable for liberation struggle in every iteration, right? I'm not, I'm talking out of a cisgender male body. I know that, you know what I mean? But I'm talking about anger in all the different forms and iterations and embodiments that I've experienced and seen, feminist and trans and, young people, all kinds of folks who are animated by their anger in these moments of abolitionist militancy. I think we need to embrace that as well. I think those are the things that we need to think more deeply about. And here's the thing, I don't see those things as separate or even necessarily in contradiction to the other things that are joyful, that are about community, and that are about building. I'll say the ways in which I feel most bonded to the communities of which I'm a part, and the relationships, including my relationship with you, of which I'm part, are with people who are like willing to fuck with my anger. You know what I mean? Like that's intimate. And it's also principled, and it's deeply political in the sense that y'all like embrace me because I'm trying to purpose that shit for something, right? And you also put me in check when it's gonna spin out of control and become self-destructive or harm somebody else. Like that's what I'm talking about. So I don't mean this in any kind of casual way. I understand the gravity of these terms and concepts and forces in the world, anger and violence and destruction. But I'm saying we need to be as nuanced and caring and deep about it as we are about all these other factors that I think make sense to foreground because it maybe draws folks in and it demystifies what we mean when we say abolition, right? But when we're talking about actually mobilizing around a politics and a force of abolition, that we need to find ways to signify, to teach, and to cultivate this kind of ethic and militancy and joy around breaking things too, breaking relationships, breaking epistemologies, breaking power structures, breaking institutions. I think it's actually, for a lot of people, I think their lives, our lives actually depend on that. And this casual glance at the historical record teaches us that, if you don't destroy certain things, then you will be targeted, and because you already are.
Yeah, and that makes me think about this other thing that's been on my mind while I was reading your book, which is that it's very deeply, what's the word I'm looking for? Rooted is not the word I'm looking for. I feel like that's a whatever, overly used word. Let me say it differently. The book foregrounds narrative analysis. Right? So there's a lot of discussion of narrative and narration and poetics and doing textual analysis of some, different movement campaigns and documents. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about that priority in terms of thinking about, the abolition of white Reconstruction, and also how you think it might interrelate with grassroots movements. So with the act of community organizing, of campaigning, what do you see as kind of the relationship there? Do they do different work? Do they do similar work? Are they mutually reinforcing? You get my point?
I think I do. I think I get it. So, but you're going to correct me if I fuck it up. So I'm going to do my best with this. Here's why I'm obsessed with a certain type of narrative analysis and narrative kind of critically theorizing and re-articulating certain narratives, both dominant narratives that flow from the state and kind of adjacent forms of knowledge making, because I see narrative production as the violence, right? In other words, I don't see narrative, symbols, stories. I don't see those things as somehow complements, or corollaries of the real violence, right? The batons, the guns, the suffering, the deprivation, the displacement, right? I see the narratives as those things. You cannot separate those things from each other, right? They cannot happen without each other. They're actually the same practices, right? And that's what renders the violence in most ways so dangerous, is the fact that they are narrated violence, right? They're not just violence for violence sake, they are narrated violence. That's how all these forms of suffering, violence, and one-sided warfare become not only normalized, not only rendered acceptable and legally condoned and state sanctioned, but righteous, right? That's what makes things righteous. It's what makes people attached to things, is the narrative project. So I'll say intellectually, the people who help me think about this, who continue to help me think about this the most, are Sylvia Wynter and Frantz Fanon, right? Two diasporic Black radical revolutionary intellectuals, abolitionists, anti-colonialists, et cetera, that understood this better than pretty much anybody, was to think about the condition of civilization, the condition of anti-Blackness, the condition of coloniality as narrative projects, and frankly, of liberation struggle and anti-colonial struggle and Black revolutionary struggle as narrative fucking projects, right? So Fanon has the famous passage when he, writes about how the world changes when you realize that the colonizers' body and flesh, that they bleed just like you, right? They bleed just like the colonized. There's something about, folks have written about this endlessly. There's archives of writing about that particular passage in Fanon's, Fanon's kind of chapter in Wretched of the Earth. But I think about this first and foremost when I'm working with that, and when I'm allowing that to kind of settle with me, is that Fanon's talking about a narrativity of violence here. It's a re-narration of violence, right? It's also a re-narration of vulnerability and suffering, which is to say that those who are in power, in kind of inhabit the positions of domination and power, are vulnerable in ways that narratively are not accessible to us, because we think about them as fucking invincible, right? And we think about attacking them as being impossible or irresponsible, right? Or so dangerous it should not be attempted. And yet here's Fanon and then Wynter doing the same thing by thinking about, the project of kind of global European humanism as being the same kind of thing. And then you attack that and you undermine it, and you create possibility for a totally different way, not only of politics, but of relating to each other and relating to the people who are your opponents, relating to the people who are holding the positions of dominance over you. And I'll say that the reason why I think this is also so crucial is because when you look around at what's happened since the summer of 2020, there's been this scramble to narrate what justice is, right? I'm using the term justice broadly here. People use other words and adjoin it to some notion of justice. That's a narrative struggle, and there's been moments where abolition has gained traction within the narrative struggle, meaning, as Mariam Kaba famously wrote in the New York Times, right? We literally mean abolish the police, right? There's been times where that's gotten some traction. There's been other times where militant, liberal, progressive reformists have circulated narratives of their own that undermine that message, right? While sometimes still using the terms of abolition, right? So they will actually tie militant reformism to the term abolition, and now you got a whole other narrative project happening that's incredibly undermining and damaging, again, to that long history of diasporic Black revolutionary and abolitionist struggle. So the narrative project, the narrative struggle, the counter warfare around narrativity is central to everything. Otherwise, you can't win the kind of critical mass, critical traction, critical energy that you need to get things moving. And I learned this in many ways. I've learned this in unique and new ways from artists, and I don't consider myself an artist, but I'm around people who are artists that are engaged with abolitionist practices in various ways and take that shit so seriously, right? They're doing study groups, they're doing, experimental projects, they're doing it collectively, and the way in which they're thinking about this is along the lines of a certain type of aesthetic, disrupting and recreating a different type of aesthetic, as well as of a different type of narrative. They take that shit seriously, which I think is something that all of us can and should learn from. Is how central that is to everything. That becomes the centerpiece of community as well. Like, you don't have community without a narrative, and the problem is that most of the narratives that are prevalent are narratives that at most push people to a kind of liberal center. So I think that's why I'm so invested in that. Is I see the damage that narratives do, and I also see how narratives can mobilize. How they can activate, they can mobilize, they can radicalize. And most of all, how narratives are subjects of study, of collective study and collective making. So it's both a creative and an intellectual, collective intellectual project all the time.
Okay, but talk to me, not okay, Dylan, that's cute. That's not what I mean. What what I mean is, and part of what I care about most, as you know, is what's useful for organizers, right? So, and organizers are not unfamiliar with anti-intellectualism, right? So there's all kind of ways that I can imagine movement people being like, this is completely irrelevant. This has nothing to do with the struggles that we're facing on the ground, right? I was involved in the outside support for the hunger strikes in California that you describe in the book. And I can imagine people being like, yeah, doing a textual analysis of the demands is not as relevant as the fact that these imprisoned organizers and their supporters outside of prison were able to successfully compel the state of California to stop the use of indefinite solitary confinement, and were able to get everybody who was facing indefinite solitary confinement their cases reviewed, and many of those people were released from solitary, not released from prison, but released from solitary. Some have gone on to be released from prison. So what would you say to, detractors who are like, yeah, but
I'd say it's all good, and these things are not in contradiction and in competition with each other, and they never should be. That's the fucking problem. That's some like neoliberal capitalist bullshit where there's a kind of bottom line zero sum thing where you have the acute immediate needs that need to be met for people to fucking survive, or to at least be taken out of solitary 23-hour shoe confinement, and somehow that's in contradiction or in competition with the long-term responsibility of challenging ourselves collectively to think and do shit differently, right? It is always both things. Every revolutionary movement, or kind of analog of revolutionary movement should have taught us this by now, but it doesn't. We need to keep coming back to that, right? Is that you have the immediacy, the kind of acutely relevant, right now this needs to be done, right now this negotiation needs to happen. That's why I said at the opening of our conversation, when I distinguish between reformism and reform, right? This is the point of that argument that I make in this part of the book where I'm looking at the hunger strike, and I say, what's interesting about the demands is that nobody's saying that we want to be let out of prison, right? Why? Because there's a tactical focus on particular kinds of reform. Because what they're doing is they are trying to signify to people in the so-called free world, I eat my words every time I say that phrase, but people who are not incarcerated, they're communicating to them just how genocidal or proto-genocidal the conditions actually are, right? And that's why, I will forever for the rest of my life be fixated on the one demand that talks about how they'd like to have more photographs in their cells. Like that's actually a plank of the security housing unit hunger strikers' demands in Pelican Bay was like, let us have a couple more photographs in our cells. That's a direct message to everybody that didn't already know that what they're living is a condition of carceral genocide in which they are being kept alive, but they're being denigrated, they're being detached, they're being depersonalized every single second. So I understand the urgency of immediate goals, right? Like I do that. I'm with people on that, from advocacy to policy stuff to mutual aid stuff. I'm with the urgency of immediate goals. I feel like it's my responsibility and obligation, right? If I'm gonna take seriously that this is something that Leith has gifted us, that Dr. James Turner has gifted us, like this capacity to think and talk together, like they and others are the ones that create this possibility for us. I feel like if I'm trying to inherit that responsibility, I also am obligated to push us in our communities, in our collective, in our projects, to think and theorize and critically revisit things all the time, long term, right? Otherwise, we're going to be stuck doing survival triage shit forever, right? We will not be able to stop the genocide. We will constantly be reacting and responding and triaging it. So this is why a certain type of collective intellectual practice. If you don't like intellectual, fuck it, call it study. Right, I found since summer 2020 when people they started doing collective intellectual work together, but they prefer the term study. Cool. They prefer the term book club. No Name started that book club. They got that place out in LA. It's badass, right? I don't care what people call it, right? But these forms of collective thought, of collective analysis, where you're sharing that stuff, in most ways the opposite of what academics do, because what academics tend to do is they individualize that, then they kind of brand it with their name and claim it as their property, right? If you're thinking about this stuff in a collective context, in a collective setting, all those ideas and arguments and theorizations and analysis that you're sharing with each other have no choice but to leak into what you do practically, right? And that's what I'm trying to honor. That's what I'm trying to push for. So I don't see these things as contradictory. They might be in tension with each other, yes, right? That's what we have to argue about, right? Is pushing for this particular short-term urgent thing going to compromise something that is irreparable in our long-term goals, right? That's what we debate about, right? But I would say I would accept the idea that if I'm trying to like engage people in a theoretical conversation about epistemology in the middle of a conversation about how we're going to decarcerate somebody tomorrow, then they're probably right. What I'm saying is irrelevant to that. and I need to be put in line. It's like, no, we're not talking about that right now. We'll talk about that after we figure out how to get this person out. That's cool. I'm good with that. But I also think it's a responsibility to keep coming back to the work of collective study. You know, if we're serious, if we're not going to be just responding in defensive and trying to do damage and casualty management all the time, right? There's nothing more demoralizing. And I mean demoralizing in the way that theorists of genocide talk about it. Like demoralizing groups of people is one of the key foundations for genocidal violence, right? Is to demoralize people as a whole, as a collective. If we are constantly engaged in urgent casualty management, urgent triage, urgent responses to deadly state violence, if that's all we are equipped and able and willing to do, then we're ensnared in a kind of trap of being demoralized all the time. And I'm trying to resist that. I think we need to overthrow that and destroy that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm for study. I'm for study all the time. And the way that you just described that, in contrast to how you were describing, the limits of reform, really are making me think that part of what you're getting at there is that we're generating and cultivating in ourselves and in each other the capacity to think beyond what currently exists, right? So our abolitionist politics require us to imagine the future all the time and to make it real. And if we're not willing, to engage in some of that intellectual work, then we are much, much more vulnerable, I think, to the pressures of reformists who want to say, this is the limit, this is as far as you can go. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, the other side, the enemy. So by the way, I want to just highlight something you said, 20 minutes ago, because you said this to me more than once. And I'm going to start citing you every time I repeat this, but you said that we need to identify our enemies, right? And that is serious work, because it's not automatic who are, it's not an automatic kind of determination who our enemies are. We need to collectively think about what it means to do that, right? First of all, what it means to do it, and also who they are. So it's both, right? Who are the enemies, and what does it mean to identify them as such? Because I'm with you on that. I think it is time overdue to do that, but I think it's especially crucial to do it now, because there are a lot of enemies who are presenting themselves as our allies, our friends, and even our fucking leaders, right? And I'm about to say names. I'm going to bite my tongue because I don't want people to fixate on the names I was going to say, right? But y'all know who I'm talking about, and they're not
He
necessarily
names names in the book.
Yeah. They're people in your neighborhood. They're people in your city. They're people that you see, on fucking CNN, MSNBC, Democracy Now, blah, blah, blah. You get it. But when you say that, when you say identify the enemies, I think what we also need to understand is that the work of collective study helps us think into the fight, right? Because I don't know that this is a statement of humility for me. I don't know that I'm equipped to think about futurity and the other side of things, right? That's one of my limitations. Like, I really do fucking try, right? And I'm around people who do that. That's why, like, I've enjoyed being in the company and community with like abolitionists and revolutionary artists, because they do this shit in ways that like change the way I think and, feel and stuff. But I think my wiring is so much about just being honored to be part of the fight, that I feel like my skill set, like my limited role, is to just urge us collectively to think and study as we enter the fight, right? Because otherwise, here's the other point I was going to make. Because otherwise, we are surrendering the grounds of dense intellectual work, study, analysis, and research to our enemies because they are doing it, right? We kind of should intuitively know this, but we really need to take seriously how, I'm talking about the enemies who are on the far right, all right? The militarized groups that want elimination of most of the folks that are on this call, that are in this webinar, that are watching this video, right? They wouldn't mind if you were just eliminated, right? Those folks take study dead serious, right? They have institutes and think tanks built, right? So they've got tons of capital and all that kind of shit to create fancy institutes and think tanks and sometimes entire universities around those forms of collective study to do the work of civilization. I'm using capital C, civilization, as a verb, right? They do the work of civilization. They take studies deeply, deeply, deeply seriously. They've done it for centuries. And to the extent that people who are serious about liberation struggle, about abolition, don't do our own versions of this, right? That struggle for some kind of autonomy, but which are at least as serious as the forms of study that our enemies undertake, then we will continuously be demoralized. We will continuously be ineffective. We will continuously be stuck playing with these horizons of reform and reformism, rather than getting to that possibility of another side, of another world, of another future that maybe, you know, y'all can live. And I don't know, I'm ready. I don't know if I'm ready to. I might not make it.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Dylan. I want to think about one other kind of set of provocations, and it's one that you and I have been engaged in conversation about over years now. And I think, you know, I'm with you, but it is somewhat provocative. You talk about, you know, this civilization project as countering war, as countering genocide. And in the book, you talk about evisceration as well, right? Can you talk about, just say a bit more about why frame it in those terms? Why escalate to those terms? And, you know, I think most people here will get it, but I think it'll be useful also for you just to lay it out a bit.
I say I want to escalate and deepen at the same time. All right. So let me say it's both those things. I know that's kind of what you meant. So this is going to sound so simplistic, but I really mean this as a kind of point of political principle. Terms and keywords are so fucking important, right? Like it's like the terms and keywords that we use when we talk, when we think, when we organize, when we create, are so fucking important. And so, to use terms like warfare, genocide, evisceration, right? What it does, as far as I'm concerned, is it more honestly communicates what the stakes are of what we think we are doing, right? It also helps to delineate who's serious and who's full of shit, right? And I'm not saying it's always that easy, but sometimes it does that work for you, right? If you escalate terms, you kind of can sometimes figure out in a certain room, in a certain community, a certain group, who is serious and who is trifling. And so when I say that, I also mean, obviously when you're using certain key terms and words, you have to define them, you have to talk about them, you have to again, build a narrative around what those terms mean for what we do politically and how we organize and how we think, write, and research and study. But I will say that this escalation, I think, is completely necessary, because what it really does is it doesn't raise the stakes, it just tells you what the stakes already are. But maybe we were in a little bit of denial about just how urgent everything actually is, like what that to the extent that we're willing to concede certain things in a particular type of struggle, right? Then who are we leaving vulnerable, right? Whose suffering are we taking for granted, right? I mean, this is part of the whole rubric that, the kind of the delineation of anti-Blackness is a very peculiar, irreducible, singular form of civilization building, right? Like that's the shit that oftentimes gets taken for granted in certain kind of coalitional and reformist formations is the suffering, the vulnerability, the violence created by anti-Black violence as a foundational term. Same with occupation and settlerism. That occupation and settlerism, the ongoing colonial and colonizing projects, those things are generally, until relatively recently, are generally actually just kind of taken for granted. They're presumed as a state of being things. So if you do the work of building an escalated lexicon right? I'm gonna use your word, right? Escalating your lexicon, therefore deepening and escalating your narrative. Those things can't be taken for granted anymore. When you don't take those things for granted, it changes everything, right? And I'm, you know, and I see that, right? It changes the way we talk, the way we think, and what we do.
Yeah, and I mean, you know me, I don't think escalation's a bad thing. I think escalation is tactical, right? And so, I mean, thank you for that answer. I think that's really helpful and it helps us see the stakes, but it also helps us think about how to respond to the stakes. So I appreciate that. I guess I'm interested also in thinking, and we're getting really good questions in, so we'll get to those in just a minute. If you are somebody who's percolating something, please follow the rules, even though Dylan never follows the rules, and put your stuff in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get at all of that stuff. There's some great stuff in there, lots of stuff to think about. So one of the questions that I have is a question that is, I think, tangential to what's in the book in some ways, but I think resonates with it a bit, and is something that I talk a lot about with people when we're doing political education in community or movement settings, which is about the protagonism of people in struggle. And so, you know, I think part of why I'm thinking of it in relationship to your book is, you know, there's a lot of heavy stuff going on in the book. I mean, going on in the world and in history. So I'm not relegating it to the pages of your book. I think you're pointing out what is true. And I think there's also a way that can be demolishing for people's sense of their own protagonism in struggle. And I don't just mean like, what can somebody do to get involved, right? I mean, that's a real question, and I'm not trying to be flip about that, because I think for some people that's where they're at, that's the conversation they need to have. But I think I'm asking at a slightly different place, which is how, in the face of staggering violence, of staggering amount of resources, of staggering institution building and history of domination, are we to think about people in struggle as protagonists in transformation, as protagonists in this story of change? Does that make sense where I'm going?
It does. And let me get behind it a little bit, because I've been thinking about that question for my whole adult life, basically, right? Shit, that's 30 years. I'm 40, I'm gonna be 49 soon. So that's like 30 fucking years, right? Like thinking about exactly that, you know, because you get it all the time, especially when you're a teacher. I'm not talking about university teacher. I'm talking any kind of teacher. If you're teaching on this stuff, whether it's for a day or whether it's for 10 weeks, I think most of us have probably experienced the moment where the people we're in conversation with will reflect back to us and say, holy shit, Rachel, what the fuck do we do? Right? Like we just spent this time thinking with you, and what you just mapped out for us is the fact, A, that some of the stuff that we thought was an accomplishment was actually the opposite, right? That it actually allowed our enemies to expand their grip on us, right? And number two, that the things we think we should do are ineffective, or they're just doomed, right? I mean, so people, so what the fuck do we do, Rachel? I mean, so we've been there, and I get that. So I've been thinking about this, and I still think about it. I don't have like a definitive answer, but I will say this: when I get behind that, I think the reason why a lot of people will articulate a sense of a sense of, you know, demobilization, of disempowerment, of not being a kind of actor within the historical context, right, is that your conversation or your ideas and your collective study have altered the question of how to struggle, and that is demobilizing if the question of how do we struggle undermines what you're already doing. I think that's actually okay, right? I think it's okay. Obviously, that's not a condition I would want to last for very long, right? But I think to bring the question to folks in a real way, how do we struggle, right? How do we engage in collective struggle? How do we do this work or carry forward this kind of historical responsibility of liberation, decolonization, abolition, and so forth. Like, how do we do that? And to ask that in a real way, in a critical way, which, you know, examines and reflects on how the things that people might be taking for granted as their basic operating paradigm for how they struggle, that might not be the most effective way. It might be the opposite of that. I think it's okay to be caught up in a moment of demobilizing, because what it really is, I mean, I think about it in some ways in the terms of guerrilla warfare, right? If we take the depth of guerrilla warfare theory and practice seriously, then we understand that retreat is sometimes the most necessary, effective, and principled and tactical maneuver. That's how I think about that, right? Sometimes we need to encourage each other to go into a condition of momentary retreat, figure out what the fuck it is we're doing, right? Like, why are things moving this way? Why are things not moving that way? And then bring that question back. Okay, if we're saying now in renewed and reinvigorated terms, how do we struggle? What we're actually trying to think about is, you know, we come back now to the terms of creation and destruction at the same time. Maybe we need to leave behind or maybe aggressively destroy these old ways of doing things and think creatively, collectively, and radically about how we go about moving into other ways of being in community with each other and struggling, right? So to ask the question of how to struggle can be momentarily about retreat and demobilization, but I think if it's posed in the right ways, if it's posed in the ways that are narrated by the collective urgency toward freedom, liberation, abolition, and so forth, then it becomes a real question, right? Not just a demobilizing pronouncement, but it becomes a real question, and that's where some cool shit happens, right? Like, and this is part of why it was so frustrating being in certain circles in the Bay Area during the time when we met each other, when we started doing work together, right? Is that in the Bay Area, because it's so thick with kind of liberal, progressive, nonprofit organizations and kind of networks like that, there's a real hesitancy, if not, you know, outright resistance to raising the question of how to struggle in a real way, right? Because shit is all mapped out. You got your deliverables, right? You got your funders, you got your limitations, and that's that. So to go to other sites where I'm privileged to be able to have these conversations with people and ask the question how to struggle in a real way, and new creative, different forms of organization, community, and mobilization come about. I think that's where the present and future actually have to be, because precisely because the paradigms that have been I think canonized by the ensemble of philanthropic foundations, of nonprofit organizations, and at this point of social media clout, like the forms of political work, struggle, and organizing that are being canonized by a combination of those apparatuses, usually in concert with the state and with, you know, corporate capitalism and neoliberalism. Those things are all about reproducing the civilizational violence that we're trying to overthrow, right? So I think this is a particular moment in which raising the question of how to struggle becomes crucial, and momentary demobilization might be okay if we think about it as a guerrilla warfare style retreat to galvanize and rethink and reorganize and re-strategize how we move.
Yeah, that makes me think of two things that I want to ask you after. The first is about struggle itself, and, you know, part of what I heard you saying, and so this is just, I guess, like to check, is this actually what you're saying, is that there's a devaluation of struggle, period, in the time that we're living in, and that the kind of act of being able to struggle well is not valued, and that might be a deficit that we're trying to get out from under. But then it also makes me think, you know, this kind of reformulation, restructuring of how we do what we do takes me to work that I know you've been doing around mutual aid, and just wondering a bit about infrastructures of collective care, and if there's a way to, I know that you've thought about this, not have these be instead of struggle, right? To use these kind of projects of collective care as a basis for struggle, as a basis for contestation. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
I mean, if it's cool, let me start with that second point, because I think there's one piece of this that I feel like I can, it's not a contribution, it's more of just highlighting what I've learned from people around me. So I'm a student of mutual aid. I'm like a worker bee within mutual aid projects. During and since the pandemic, I've done my best to, you know, empower those kind of projects, participate in them. I'm a worker, right? I'm not a leader. I'm not an organ. I mean, I'm just in it, right? So like, let me just say that for folks, that and I really feel honored by that. You know, it's a way of being in community with people that gives a different understanding of what security is, right? Of what it means to be building security for each other against state violence, right? Against the technologies of anti-Blackness, against colonial power, against misogyny and transphobia. Like, in other words, it's a fight, right? Mutual aid and collective care for communities and people that are targeted by this shit, that is a fucking fight. It is actually counter warfare, right? So I want to put it that way. And the thing I was going to highlight is part of what I think is so critical about thinking through what mutual aid means right now is it also means that collective care means honoring and then revisiting the histories of collective autonomous self-defense. Right? That self-defense is central to what we call mutual aid in the abolitionist sense of mutual aid, right? In the Black radical sense, in the radical feminist sense, in the trans abolitionist sense of mutual aid, right? Collective community self-defense is critical to that. So that literally means being prepared as communities to defend yourselves against violence and to aggressively defend yourselves against violence. In other words, you're not merely reacting to attack, right? But you're building a community that people know they will be dealing with if they try to come for you, right? That's real self-defense. Right? And again, this is something I learned initially from the rich diasporic history of Black radical and Black revolutionary abolitionism, right? Is those forms of community self-defense means that you undertake aggressive action, you periodically undertake destructive action, and that actually works to defend your fucking community, to defend your people, you know, your loved ones and so forth. So that, just getting at that's how I think about the mutual aid piece, you know. I mean, it's not a coincidence that I was never a gun owner until 2 years ago, right? And then I started thinking about this stuff. I mean, I took my own words seriously, right? And now I'm a registered, licensed, you know, for what it's worth, gun owner. I have 7 guns. I know how to use them, right? And I'm in community with people. I don't think about it as an individual self-defense. I'm in community with people who are also thinking about that kind of preparedness as, you know, a responsibility and obligation for some people in the community to have, right? I'm not advocating everybody goes out there and does it, but if you do think that it's something that you can handle, you can take responsibility for, and that you can do in community people, absolutely, right? It's serious and it's aggressive. I think it has to be taken up. Okay, the second piece about struggle. You actually caught me there, because I think when I was saying struggle before, I meant it in more than one way. So now you're forcing me to define what it means, you know? I think for simplicity's sake here, for time's sake, I'll just reduce it to 2 versions of it. One is the form of struggle you started the question with, which is how do we struggle with each other internally in our communities, in our collectives, in our movements? I think we actually need a whole political education, cultural education, and re-narration of how we do that with each other, you know? So that disagreement and vigorous debate and differences of politics and analysis are not reduced to a certain kind of identity politics, let me say, right? Like the worst kind of neoliberal identity politics, where like, you can't tell me shit because you're Japanese and I'm Filipino, right? And your people colonized or whatever, you know. I mean, I'm being a little simplistic about it, but it's also real. And I think folks know that. Folks know that sometimes these identity politics get in the way of these vigorous disagreements in debates. So I think we need to address that. I think we need to address that. And I think we need to be open about it. And I think we need to understand that the stakes are way too high to be trifling with minimizing the intensity of how we can struggle with each other. I think we need to be able to do that robustly. And then there's the second point, the second, you know, way of struggling, which is how do you struggle against your enemy? And that's, I think, what I was more talking about, but I'm really kind of talking about both, right? So I think when I talked about the retreat piece, you know, about taking the retreat, I think part of the retreat is to do both. You got to figure out how are we going to struggle with each other and figure out what we're doing wrong and how we can do better. And also, how do we fight them, right? How do we fight them? Because what we were doing before, it got us some traction, but now we're not quite there. We got to come back. We got to reconvene. We got to think about this. We got to struggle with each other. Now we got to struggle with each other in order to struggle against them. right? The enemies, as you put it, the enemies that we've identified. How do we struggle against them? How do we take those fuckers down, right? How do we eliminate them, or how do we actually just disempower them so much that we can actually build our own capacity for freedom struggle? That's what I think. That's what I think the moment is that we're in absolutely right now in an intense way. We need to ask these questions.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to get into some of these questions that people are sticking in the Q&A. And I'm going to start with one that a couple people have asked in different ways. And is, you know, a big piece of what's in the book is a chapter of what's in the book. What's your beef with mass incarceration? Why avoid the term mass incarceration? That's not what anybody asked. People were much more diligent in asking their questions, but you get my point. Why is that something to be avoided?
Okay, because it's not the. This is my quick response is because it's not the masses that are being incarcerated. It's not. It's a sneaky liberal term. The regime of the prison industrial complex, of policing, of criminalization, of all the forms of detention and caging that are happening, they are targeting specific people's populations and ways of being in the world, right? It is asymmetrical. It is not the mass. Right. Now, I say that I also want to honor the fact that since the late 1990s, within Black radical and Black abolitionist circles, the term is used, but when it is used, it's synonymous with mass Black incarceration, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm down with that all day, all night. What I'm talking about are the ways that mass incarceration has become a kind of canonical term since the publication, mostly since the publication of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. It's really kind of become the paradigmatic catchword such that Hillary Clinton used it in her 2016 campaign in a famous tweet, right? So you have the Democratic Party has fully incorporated and mobilized around the phrase and term mass incarceration, and they're the least of it. You know, there's all these think tanks, these foundations, et cetera, that have entire like policy building, funding streams, research clusters, all kinds of institutional infrastructures are built around the phrase mass incarceration, and the logic is to make it no longer such a mass, right? It's to maybe reduce it so we can say it's not as much of a mass incarceration. So there's also a liberal logic to it, in addition to this kind of white supremacist, multiculturalist humanism that gets attached to the term mass incarceration. So that's why I prefer the terms of warfare. I prefer the terms of targeting. I prefer the terms of genocide, you know, of anti-Blackness and so forth, because I think they're just more accurate. I think mass incarceration is a sloppy fucking term. We got to stop using it. We got to say what we mean.
And there it is, folks. There's the answer. All right. So I'm going to read this question from the one and only Connie One, and I'm just going to read it. So can you talk about the ways that abolition and abolitionists are currently being used as forms of identity politics, such that they legitimize and authorize individualized forms of violence? In similar words, can you also name what it is that we need to be destroying, as it will become increasingly trendy to claim abolitionist politics without its focus on destroying anti-Blackness?
What's up, Connie? Connie's somebody I've known as long as I've known Rachel. So this question's coming out of that history too. So I want to honor that. Connie One is the executive director of AAPI Women Lead, badass, abolitionist, sex worker liberation, etc. organization based in the Bay with national influence. So thank you for that question, Connie, as always. Yeah, the first question, the way in which Connie formulated the first question actually bears the answer in its posing, which is to think about how the terms abolition and abolitionist have become part of a certain kind of popular political and cultural lexicon, so that influencers, academics, people who are perceived to be leaders, right, grab that term and use it as part of their profile, are taking advantage of it to mobilize a certain kind of sensibility of revolt and mobilization, right? Usually tied to capital, usually tied to some form of funding. You know what I mean? Like, it'll bring that shit in from people who are well-meaning, who want to, you know, who are either curious or are earnest about trying to push forward with abolitionist praxis of some kind. So there's an opportunism around this. So it's an identity politics that is structured in grift and opportunism. And The forms of individualized violence that happen out of that are countless, right? Everything from, folks who have the microphone, the platform, and the clout crowding folks out, right? That's a deeply violent act. All right, like when folks who have that kind of clout crowd other folks out because they have claimed and are trying to monopolize the terms and the identity of abolitionists, that's a violent fucking act. Displacing people like that, it's the opposite of liberation struggle to individualize it. So that's what I mean when I say that the question has its answer embedded in it. The individualization of these terms is the violence, right? That's the foundational violence of doing that kind of thing. And what it also then ends up doing is it authorizes people who have clout, who have the microphone, who have the funding stream, who have the recognition, meaning the recognition from a kind of, outside, mainstream corporate media world, right? It authorizes them to perform and act in all kinds of ways that completely move against abolitionist forms of community and collectivity, including denigrating other folks and delegitimating them, subjects them to all kinds of violence. And then in terms of the second part of the question, the things that need to be destroyed, I know what I think needs to be destroyed, but I feel like that is a deep question for collective study. I'll say that first of all, right? Like, I'm not sure that I should be prescribing it, although I have my ideas, right? Like, I think the police need to be destroyed, right? I think all forms of apartheid and settler colonial occupation and displacement need to be destroyed. Read that as what you will, right? I'm on the side of the Palestinian people. I think all forms of state detention, incarceration, caging, and border militarization need to be destroyed, right? I think in some way, oppressive nation state militaries need to be destroyed. Now, not all militaries need to be. I think that there are militaries that are necessary for people who are defending themselves. I'm talking about sovereign, autonomous forms of militarization, actually, which is not the same as like first world global North colonial militarization. I'm separating those things. But I will say that a certain relation of power relative to things like knowledge, things like curriculum, things like how people learn, things like the paradigms of how human being is formulated, how human being is understood to exist properly in the world, those things need to be destroyed, which is actually in many ways is at the roots of trying to destroy the structures and the violences of the specific structures and violences of anti-Blackness. So there's much more to that, but I think again, this is the grounds of a collective conversation, and that's something I would really, really fucking welcome. Right? If we could actually like get into groups or not even get into groups, like work with our existing communities and relationships and collectives and talk about, all right, y'all, what do we need to fucking destroy? Right? What needs to be broken and destroyed? I think this is the conversation that I don't think we have enough. And at least not in a sustained and serious and in practical way. Like, what can we actually destroy here? Because there's shit we can do right now.
I'm going to jump around a little bit here in the questions. We're definitely not going to get to all of them, so I'm sorry to disappoint people up front, but I'm going to move into this question about the nonprofit industrial complex, because I know you got all kind of opinions about that. And the question is about defeating that sector, right? Their existence is structurally determined and resourced. The solace of advice will out-organize them is fleeting, anti-materialist, and no help. As an organizer on the front lines, their influence, reach, and culture of suffocation and deferment is killing us. Do you have a response to that, Dylan?
Yeah, I do, and it's my response is, by the way, I just want to qualify this. The response I'm going to give out is one I'm actually really uncomfortable with, but I'm going to give it because I think it might be one way to get at this. I think that we need to understand the nonprofit industrial complex as its own terrain of struggle, right? My tendency is to just say, like, this fucker needs to be obliterated, like the philanthropic foundations need to, they need to be complete, their resources need to be, I mean, of course, I feel like universities kind of more or less really need to, the academy definitely needs to be abolished. I think universities need to be abolished in their current state and completely radically repurposed in terms of land back, in terms of reparations and everything else, right? And that's a whole Scholars for Social Justice project in and of itself. But in terms of the nonprofit industrial complex, I think it needs to be treated as its own terrain of struggle, as its own complex terrain of struggle. I think we need to understand how Just as with universities and colleges, you have people who have day jobs there who are willing to do what it takes to extend the grounds of the fight, who are willing to figure out ways to to liberate resources, to redistribute modestly, perhaps, but nonetheless modestly redistribute resources, and get at expanding some of the capacities of folks who are not part of the nonprofit industrial complex. So I think that's an initial thing that could be undertaken, but it requires kind of careful, tactical conversations with people who are caught up in that shit. And there's precious few of them. Right? There's not a lot of people who I would identify as being worthy of really deeply engaging with in that terrain, but I think they are there. I mean, our person, Connie is one of them, right? I mean, she has to deal with all that shit. She has to deal with funders. She has to deal with the nonprofit apparatus and all that shit. But like, I'll ride with Connie any day. And there's a precious few people that I will do that with. So I think to answer, to get at Brooke, part of your point is, now, the kind of flippant response, well, out organize them. Yeah, you're right. That's not that helpful because it's really fucking hard to do when they got the millions and you got almost nothing. You got, what modest resources, what limited resources you have, your community has. But I do think that there are particular kinds of tactical partnerships, maybe underground partnerships that can and should be cultivated and maybe reproduced in the long term. And I know that there are folks who are scattered around university and college settings to do that kind of thing. By the way, if you all have any ideas to do that kind of shit, I co-direct the Center for Idea Society. I have a very modest amount of resources, but they're there to be redistributed, right? So that's what I do with that. Again, it is what it is, y'all. Like, it's a modest response. This is not revolutionary action, right? It's a modest tactical response to an immediate problem. That's all it is. But I think ultimately the elimination of the NPIC is going to be, part and parcel of eliminating things like racial capitalism. It's going to be eliminating things like coloniality. You get at those things and the NPIC crumbles.
I'm going to jump ahead here because this question that Tyler's raising is one that I care a lot about and I know that you have opinions about, right? So he's wondering if you can talk about the limits of multiculturalism policing campaigns as a particular form of reformism as counterinsurgency.
So there's nobody who knows better how this shit works than Tyler Wall. All right, so like, let me just put that out there. Like, Tyler, I signed your and David's books in both my classes this quarter, and I got them coming through. So the key point to Tyler's question, in my view, is counterinsurgency. Right, we have to focus attention on what counterinsurgency is, the shapes that it takes in a particular historical moment, how institutions strategize counterinsurgency, and what it is that they are strategizing counterinsurgency against. Right, what is the insurgency that they are countering? In this particular period, the counter that they're formulating is against the capacities for communities that are targeted by police violence, particularly by anti-Black police violence in this moment, to effectively demystify police power. That's number one, right? By demystify police power, I mean to take down its authority, to not take it for granted, and to actively practice disrespecting it, right? So that's insurgency. Right? When the colonial authority, when the plantation authority, when their authority gets not only questioned, but actively overthrown, actively disrespected because it never was worthy of respect in the first place, right? That's a particular kind of insurgency that needs to be countered. So part of what Tyler's mentioning with multiculturalist policing, right? The multiculturalism of policing, the aggressive recruitment of LGBTQ plus people, of women, cisgender women, of so-called peoples of color, of Black folks, etc., into various police forces. That is an act to try to, number one, save police power from its own obsolescence, because so much of it is still attached to kind of classical paradigms of white supremacy, right? So it's a scramble to save itself from that shit. But arguably, most importantly, to solicit targeted people's identification with police power as empowerment, right? Not just as employment, but as empowerment, as inclusion and empowerment in some kind of real way. It's a narrative strategy. So I think in that sense, we need to understand it for what it is. It's about cultivating an identification with police power, not just about expanding the roles of people who are employed by police. It's not merely a DEI initiative, but it is a DEI narrative, right? And it is intended to counter all of these surges against the existence and legitimacy of police power. That's what the counterinsurgency is. I see you, Devarian.
Hey, Devarian.
Thank you. So what a way to end. For those of you that came in and out, you should have stayed the whole time, because Dylan is bringing fire on everybody. Not naming names, but naming names at the same time. And if you want more details, please pick up that book. You got a copy of it in your reach, White Reconstruction. Dylan, you have with you? Okay, that's all right. Go to bookshop, go to your local bookstore, cop that book, White Reconstruction, so you can learn about the terror of liberal reform, about this issue of counterinsurgency through multicultural policing, delve deeper into questions around abolition in real ways, the power of narrative and intellectual collective work, or what we could just call study. So much, so rich, that things that were provoked by this conversation today, but we could have more discussions. We could have another hour or two. Go to the book, read the book, and then pester Dylan with emails and Twitter posts, right? Harass him. Make this a collective conversation beyond the individual. So Dylan, we thank you. Rachel, thank you so much. Someone who's been doing this abolition work before many of us even heard the term. We are honored to have you two in conversation, in respect to the one and only Leith Mullings and her Salon. Mia Silva, behind the scenes, we thank you. From Scholars for Social Justice, we thank you, the participants, to being a part of this organization, this community. If you like what we're doing, please know that there will be another Salon on October 13th, where Erica Edwards will be discussing her book, The Other Side of Terror, Black Women and the Culture of U.S. Empire. And I just want to remind you all that if you are interested in future events, webinars, activities, there is a form, a Google form in the chat that you can fill out and connect to Scholars for Social Justice. Rachel keeps saying she is not a scholar, but we hope that she will become a more direct member within our circle, because we consider you a scholar and not an academic, as Dylan pointed out, in the most positive way. So we're going to embrace that, and the same way that we embrace you all for this conversation. So thank y'all so much, everybody in Zoom land. We thank you for being there. Much to chew on, much to think about, much to keep you up at night.
I don't say this enough. Devarian, I don't say this enough. I love you. Yeah. I love you. I love you. Thank you.
I love you too.
I just want to express that. I don't say that.
No, I appreciate that. Yes.
You don't know me for my anger and cursing and all that shit, but I do. I feel so much love toward you. So
no, thank you, brother.
That's recorded, right? That's on. That's
yes, that is recorded.
Right?
It is recorded.
You got
it right in the last minute before we cut it off. So on the real, we thank y'all so much for being here, for being a part of this. This is just the beginning. Remember our campaign, ARIS, Abolition, Reparations, Investment, and Security, in the highest sense of the words, is not a done deal. We expect you all to be a part of us and to help us work through that campaign, how it can be made manifest on the ground, on campuses and communities across the country. This is a part of that thinking, that study, that struggle. So again, thank you all. Have a good night. Please come back on the 13th and anytime that we call you. Peace.